Welcome to the GCP-Mindset channel and all topics on clinical research.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining our webinar today. If this is your initial experience attending our series, a warm welcome to you. For those who are returning, it's lovely to have you back. I've just recognized some familiar names, so welcome, and thanks once again for joining us. We sincerely hope that you find these sessions enriching and valuable, and we look forward to having you return for more. This year, we have an exciting lineup of webinars planned, and they will be taking place once a month. So as long as you haven't opted out, we'll keep you informed. You'll hear from me about upcoming topics and events, so you won't miss out on any valuable insight. So a few more people joining, but without any more delays, let's dive right into our session today. Just some brief info. For those who haven't met before, my name is Carol Lazarevich. I'm the Business Development Manager at GCP Service International. And together with Dr. Andreas Boyce, we're actually in the same room. He will introduce himself shortly, and we will be hosting today's webinar. So just a little bit about our company, GCP Service. We are an international full-service CRO. So what that means is we provide clinical research services globally. And we offer a full suite of solutions to support pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device companies, and those who are developing innovative products. And now I will just hand over to Dr. Andreas Boyce, and he will introduce himself and go over the webinar.
Okay. Thank you for the nice introduction, Carol. Thank you to everyone who is attending. And there's a few people still joining, so I think we will now need to shift over to you guys to let them in. And I'll take it from here. So I myself, Andreas, I'm the CEO of GCP Service. As Carol already mentioned, we are a mid-sized international CRO. And I'm also the president of ACROSS, and through ACROSS trying to reach, let's say, communities globally and conducting clinical trials globally. I myself have participated in a number of clinical trials, drugs, medical devices, as well as with in vitro diagnostics. And I'm also the sponsor for 2 ongoing phase 2 trials. And because of that, in those constructs, we are supporting investigators with their conduct of clinical research and clinical trials, because it's getting more and more complex. And it's harder to take over that sponsorship responsibility so we help out with that. And that means it's extremely important for myself and for us to stay up to date with the latest regulations and everything. And so I took a deep dive into the draft of the ICH E6 revision 3. And I am a huge advocate for breaking knowledge barriers. I think it is really hard to learn a lot about clinical research when you're coming in from the outside. And I really want to share this and open it up and foster also a conversation and a discussion about everything clinical research. And so for me, this is also an awesome platform to share with you guys, to get your insights and ideas and just spread some knowledge and some insights at the forefront here. So just as a disclaimer, this webinar is getting recorded. We will also, for all of those that have not managed to join in here live, to post it up on YouTube, where you can find that later on as well. By staying in here, you agree to it being recorded. Just as a disclaimer. In terms of questions, I would like to post the questions at the end of this presentation so I can get through the structured content at first. Usually I like it in a little bit more of an interactive way, but I think this really helps get through some of the talking points. I do a last trip. Just as a technical comment, there's a couple of people always waiting. Okay, good. All right, so let's jump right into the topic of clinical research 2.0. That's a question mark, and one that I choose to answer at the end of the session. But what we'll for sure talk about is the latest revision of ICH E6 or GCP. And the easy way would have been to go through the entire document from start to finish and basically highlight what the changes are in the different sections. But I think it doesn't make so much sense because there's a lot of topics that are addressed all over the document, in the investigator section, the sponsor section, the principles of ICH GCP, in the new data governance section. And so I felt it was really important to compile some of them And as far as possible, I try to give references to, let's say, some of the more impactful sections that talk about it, so you can also read up on it later. So today we'll talk a little bit about the revision focus, or at least the way that I interpret it, the risk-based quality management, which is one of the focuses, as well as data governance. That's the second major one. And then talk a little bit about some of the minor topics that have changed that I think are important to address, that are necessary to look at, or that are generally interesting. And those will be some of the resource allocation and how to, let's say, delegate certain functions within a trial, a little bit about accessibility of clinical research in general and to the patient population, and then a little bit about trial documentation. So, as I'm letting in a couple more people, we have ICH GCP, and this is the starting point in Revision 2 that I want to start off with. ICH GCP, in and of itself as a guideline, already had a very strong focus on a lot of the things that I will be talking about today. And you can see here a highlight on the right side from the introduction part, in which it highlights that this guideline, that means ICH GCP, has been amended to encourage the implementation of improved and more efficient approaches to clinical trial design, conduct, oversight, and so on. In the end, all while ensuring protection for subjects and reliability of trial results. And the reason why we had revision 2 of ICH GCP was primarily based on a shift from paper-based documentation and conduct of clinical research to electronic means, which is also highlighted in the introduction. And so identifying the need to update the guidance for this shift in focus and setting standards on how electronic records should be used was in the focus of revision 2 of the guidance. And so then that begs the question, since we have not had a shift from paper to electronic anymore, or from electronic to a new medium of, let's say, clinical trial data, why do we need an update of the guidance now? Now, obviously, the first answer to that is industry-changing events. All of you that have worked in clinical research before 2020 and during the pandemic will have felt the acceleration at which new methods and new ways of conducting clinical research have been implemented. And the global pandemic was really a catalyst. And there were a lot of forced discoveries that were also embraced by regulators on the basis of emergency guidelines. And now that we have moved officially into a, let's say, post-pandemic state, the question that is sort of like on a lot of people's mind is what happens with all of the things that we changed, that where the approaches were different over the last 3 years? What do we do with these discoveries? And that's part of what this guideline update needs to address. And the second piece is that we also continue having very quickly accelerating rates of electronic data in our clinical trials, specifically through also a host of new ECOA or electronic clinical outcome assessment measurements. And here we really need to define well the risks as well as suitable requirements for implementing these solutions into our clinical trial. And this is where ICH E6 comes into play, basically. So the concepts, the key concepts within it are based on fostering a quality culture and proactively designing quality into the clinical trials and drug development itself, and identifying factors critical to trial quality and engaging stakeholders as well, as appropriate, and using proportionate risk-based approaches. So one of the key features, as already alluded to me, is risk-based quality management. That's not new, but it is definitely put into the focus of revision 3. It's about encouraging risk-based processes in more and more and more steps. While it was already a key ingredient to revision 2, it has now been put into the forefront of every last abstract of ICH GCP revision 3. And also, what needs to happen is for it to provide guidance on what is really important within a clinical trial. And I'll get to whether revision 3 succeeds in doing so, and when I'm talking about quality risk management. The second piece, as I also alluded to at the beginning already, is integration of computer systems. How to handle computerized systems, how to oversee and validate the flow of data, and how to integrate all stakeholders in the process. These are all questions that needs to be addressed and that also ICH GCP focuses on. So There's a lot of things that this needs to do. And this is my personal perception of what I think revision 3 should achieve. And it's what I'm going to highlight now, and I'll comment back at the end of the presentation so that we can or discuss, I guess, whether it fulfills, these requirements. And so the first thing that I think is extremely important is it needs to give guidance. And now you could say that it's a guideline, so obviously it's guidance. But there's nuances and there is precision in guidance that can be given that really help implement guidance. And if it's just being confronted with a buzzword, with an idea that is not fully fleshed out, it actually creates more problems than it solves. And this is something that we would be addressing throughout, especially in the quality risk management part. So it's about how to make clinical trials more efficient without endangering patients in the process. It's about embracing technological solutions without risking trial integrity. And it's about increasing diversity without inciting the fear of trials becoming slow or more costly because it's more difficult to embrace diversity. On top of that, not only giving guidance, but also giving reassurance is something that I feel this document needs to do. And that is addressing the lack of clarity that is quite apparent also in the second revision of ICH. And the primary focus of that is what to really consider as important for a risk-based quality management, RBQM approach. What is allowed and where is a no-go and how to comply with expectations. In the end, I hope this reassurance that should be given through this guideline should provide help for self-help. Not help for self-help. It's important. Providing guiding principles to the community is what's necessary through this document. Otherwise, the natural reaction is to be as conservative as possible. And that is exactly not what a risk-based approach is. And for a document that highlights the need for risk-based implementation so much as the ICH revision does, it needs to provide means by defining what it means to be compliant. So let's jump right into that and let's talk a little bit about quality risk management. So to start off, just because it's so important for the revision, I want to have one slide on the background. For most of the other things, I will expect that some amount of background is present. And I'm happy to otherwise answer some questions. So let's briefly discuss about the basics of quality risk management. And that starts with the risk. And you can already see here, I refer not to ICH E6, because in fact, ICH E6 does not define risk. It also doesn't define quality. These are definitions from another set of quality standards that ICH releases, Q quality standards. And in fact, ICH Q9 is one that I would also strongly recommend you read, which has been revised also at the beginning of the year. And it sets a standard for how risk-based quality management can be executed. And in it, risk is defined as a combination of two factors. That's the probability of the occurrence of harm. And the second is the severity of that harm. So it always has these two factors that are really important. From there, quality is defined as the degree to which a set of inherent properties of product, system, or process fulfill requirements. So you set requirements and then you measure whether they are fulfilled or not. And in a risk management approach, systematic applications of quality management policies, procedures, and practices are used to assessing, controlling, communicating, and reviewing risks. So if you combine all of this as a foundation of risk-based quality management, we are assessing risks, again, probability and severity of certain processes, and then we are shaping our quality management system around it to make sure that the most impactful ones, where the risk is the highest, are safeguarded the most through our quality measures. So, and with that, in ICH E6, you can see here in the principles of ICH GCP section already, you see this reference that clinical trial processes, measures, and approaches should be implemented in a way that is proportionate to the risk to participants, as well as to the importance of the data collected. And this is a statement that you will find throughout the entirety of the document. It is at the core of basically every process, and that's why it is mentioned already this early in the principles section. And it affects everything, as you can see here. Every clinical trial process should be managed in a risk-based manner. And is that done that way? Well, let's talk about this a little bit. First of all, there is already, as I mentioned, a call for implementation of risk-based quality management in ICH E6 in the revision 2. And even before that. So it is not new, but it is still being addressed. It is still being pushed forward more and more. And that's because there is a lack of guidance regarding the effort and the formality that's required to conduct risk-based quality management. And so naturally, at absence of clear guidance, the conservative approach is to do too much, which in turn risks clinical trials because they may no longer seem feasible to execute. And that is really what we have at the moment. And so if we look at how risk-based quality management is currently being used, I can say completely inconsistently. And that from a range of discussions with different types of clients across different types of projects, and from picking up how generally different companies are implementing it and conversations on conferences and so on. And we have big pharma companies that are saying, and that's only one example of quality management in monitoring, but it's one that's really important for clinical research, to go for 0% source verification across all of the trials, which is not risk-based. And upon FDA queries, they said, okay, we will source data verify the first patient of every site, which is also not risk-based. And these are giant pharma companies that approach it like that. And on the other side, we have small, low-risk clinical trials where there's a call for 100% source data verification. And again, that's not risk-based. And also, source data verification is not a good mean to ensure trial quality in trials. There are enough publications that state this. And in terms of formality, from minimal documentation to assessing hundreds of study risks, including the potential that a site staff member may be unable to participate in the trial further because of long-term sickness or pregnancy, that's also not risk-based to put that much effort into it because you cannot focus on what's really important. And so more guidance, more clarity is necessary. And so if we look at it, basically what we see here is risk control, and that's what we have just been talking about. Risk control should be proportionate to the importance of the risk to the participants' rights, safety, and well-being, and the reliability of trial results. And that is about as clear as revision 3 gets on this point. So what are we talking about then? Well, there is one keyword, one buzzword that is thrown around quite a lot, and that is fit for purpose. It hasn't been mentioned in revision 2 and is now mentioned a total of 13 times throughout the guidance. And it really represents, to my understanding, the author's way of saying commensurate the effort with the risk. And that's it. Is there a definition of fit for purpose? No. Is guidance given on what fit for purpose exactly means and how to implement it? Unfortunately, neither. So the only thing that really changed is that we have the scope of risk-based quality management expanded. It is ingrained in more, specifically in more sections now, but we still don't exactly get an idea of what the expectation is on how to execute. So what will the impact be? Encouragement in the end to implement the risk-based approach without clear understanding of what is expected because the guidance is too vague. And so from my point of view, what is missing at the moment, and it's only a draft version, so we'll see if that changes into the final version, is a clear classification of high-risk elements of a clinical trial versus low-risk elements. And not in the way that it is currently being implemented across guidelines, by implementing a list of examples, because that is only finite. You can only produce as long of a list, and eventually you will encounter items that are not on the list. So what's more necessary is to provide guidance on a thought process by which risk and risk association can be implemented. That is really necessary. And that's something that the medical device world, for all of its other, let's say, regulatory shortcomings at times, which have improved a lot over the years, have had from their inception a clear understanding that medical devices are very diverse and you need to treat them in a very risk-based manner. And there is a very good guidance on how to classify risks in medical devices, in medical device trials. And that is something that would ideally also be translated into the drug world with some further recommendations on how to really assess risks of clinical trials. So in absence of guidance, let me take a moment and give you some, because I have some recommendations from our own practices and our use in many of our trials, and we have no regulatory compliance issues. And the foundation doesn't change through ICH revision 3. So starting out by formally assessing the risk of the trial, not of the processes, just of the trial in general, of the project, of the idea, based on a preset amount of criteria, can help shape an understanding for the level of formality that's required when approaching the risk assessment for the trial. Now, it can have many factors, some of which are highlighted here, such as indication complexity. Is it aesthetic medicine or is it oncology? Very different patient populations, very different risks. What is the country complexity like? And what is the site complexity like? Are these countries and sites that are familiar to the team that is executing on the operational team that's executing on the trial or not? In an unfamiliar trial, the risks would immediately be higher that you may miss some local requirements. And how complex is the trial in and of itself? What about the visit and treatment structure? What about the number of assessments? If there is a very dynamic dosing schedule in which patients jump from different doses to other doses, that's highly complex and many mistakes can happen. But if the trial is streamlined, it's much easier, lower risk overall. How much is known beforehand? Were there prior studies, similar products? What is the level of knowledge as you go into the trial? And if you assess all of that, you get a more subjective feeling for the risk of a study, rather more objective feeling for the risk of the study. And it helps you formalize a general risk statement for the trial that can be the foundation of why you say all of the downstream risk assessment processes no longer need to be performed at such formality. And so then the next step is scale your level of formality of risk assessment. If it's a low-risk trial, do where we did it. If it's a high-risk trial, then you should put more effort, be more exhaustive in your assessment of risks and preventive actions. And that helps keep a level of efficacy in conducting the trials. And then lastly, and only then, implement quality assurance measures based on process risks. Only once all of that is already established, move into the process where you start digging into the individual processes, in the individual steps, in the individual study sites, in the delivery of the treatment, in the assessments that are being done, and what's really important. Only once you have a clear rationale of how much effort needs to be put into that. And as I said, ICH Q9 is also great for it. Here's a process structure of it. I just want to give you the recommendation, don't just follow it. Because if you follow it for every trial is going to be very laborious for you to set this up. But make sure you understand what part of it you need, how intensively you need to look at it, and make sure you write down your rationale for how much effort you put in, because that can then not be questioned anymore afterwards. If you don't provide a rationale for what you're doing, that can be attacked, or rather scrutinized. So let's move from risk-based quality management to risk-based monitoring. As I said, risk-based monitoring is still one of the most expensive parts of a clinical trial. And so naturally, this is the part where most optimization can be found through employing risk-based strategies. And here, a lot has happened, fortunately, in ICH E6 revision 3. You can see here that brief statement that data verification can be done on the basis of using samples. So that means only part of the overall data, and support this using data analytics as appropriate. And based on your findings, your sample size, that means how much of the data you look at, may need to be increased, but doesn't necessarily and doesn't need to be across study sites. So the guidance recognizes in a very straightforward way the diversity with which monitoring can be done. And it really highlights and pushes also centralized monitoring capabilities. And in a way that complements and reduces on-site monitoring. Not that it's an additional burden that must be done by all of the sponsors that are executing on clinical trials, but rather by one that should help streamline and target on-site monitoring activities. And all of that, of course, in a risk-based manner. And on top of this, not only should monitoring be handled in a risk-based manner, also protocol deviations and the way you formally address them, the way you train, as an outcome of it, the way you change processes as an outcome of it, even that should be risk-based. And how much guidance is provided here? Well, there is guidance provided on combination of monitoring activities in general, so that is really good. And in addition, there is guidance provided as to what important data constitutes. Not to the perfect level, but at least a clear statement that safety information and trial endpoints of primary importance. I would have liked for a statement that says primary safety information and primary trial endpoints of primary importance, but you can only wish for so much, I guess. And nevertheless, the guidance is making it quite clear what's really important and what's not, and helps us reinforce the statement, which we have been preaching here for a long time also, that you should really not waste your time checking concomitant medication in your trials. So, that being said, some further recommendations. Selecting high-risk or high-impact data as compared to low-risk and low-impact data is a very good first step to see how, let's say, across all of the data that you record in your clinical trials, you can adjust the monitoring concepts. From there, it is important to define mechanisms by which you identify high-risk study sites compared to low-risk study sites. And one of the features, of course, can be how much recruitment is there. Because the more patients are enrolled at one study site, the more a systematic error will have an impact on the overall trial evaluation. But some of the high recruiting sites are extremely diligent in making sure that all of the trial processes are followed. They are very familiar with it. And so there may not be a need to go to the high recruiting sites and rather go to a number of the lower recruiting sites that are sort of like dispersed across the study and have less engagement with the study protocol. Make sure that you implement measures that not only identify these high-risk sites, but that are also adjusting the monitoring concepts accordingly so that you allocate certain fixed visits and then move away from that and say that the rest of the visits are flexible, variable, and adjusted on identified high-risk study sites. And then, of course, communication is key because these days, there are many more stakeholders that are involved in the process. Before, we had basically only CRAs that went to the study sites, communicated with the study sites, and that was about it. In these days, CRAs represent a part of a multifunctional team that is monitoring the data integrity and also includes data managers, statisticians, medical monitors, and much more. And so using a tool and a document to communicate all of this properly and convey the vision and the strategy, that's important for two reasons. One, to help coordinate this multi-stakeholder team. And also two, to make sure that your rationality for the risk-based approach to monitoring is very clear and can also be used later on to highlight regulatory compliance. We like to use the visit schedule and use a little bit of color to use that as a foundation for communication, defining which parts of the data is supposed to be monitored just with data analysis, not monitored at all, remote monitored, or so state verified at the study site. And that's just one of the tools that you can use. There's no requirement to do it either way, but it's good to think about a strategy of incorporating the communication elements into the monitoring strategy. Let's move ahead to data governance. And data governance starts with computer systems. So you can see here, I highlight also in the guidance, of course, that systems that aid in data capture, management, and analysis, as well as those that help ensuring the quality of the information generated from the trial, should be fit for purpose, again, the buzzword, and should be implemented in a way that is proportionate to the risks to participants and the importance of acquired data. So, systems, selection, and quality assurance of systems should be fit for purpose. And if we look at the status quo, we have a swiftly rising number of solution providers and a really fragmented and diverse system landscape. And that can come from just an EDC system in which data is entered after having been collected on paper CRFs to having dozens of diverse electronic systems utilized to capture different amounts of data within a clinical trial. All of that somehow needs to be managed concordantly within one trial. And so obviously that leads to a host of issues. At the moment, there's an inconsistently, let's say, interconnectivity, and it will always remain that way. So sometimes moving data from one electronic system to another is a manual process, and that comes with the opportunity for errors. There is also a high burden for study sites due to changing systems. At the same study site, across several different studies with several different sponsors, you will have several different systems. And that means familiarity with one system is sometimes harder to attain these days, because paper was patient. It just sat there and you just need to note on it, and that was it. Everything was streamlined. Nowadays, that can be a challenge, and that will also never change. And in the end, we also have a high diversity in terms of the quality of the systems that are being implemented. There are many systems on the market that are used also for data capture, for example, that are not validated. And we have very different degrees of functionality, but still they're used within a clinical trial, and that somehow needs to be streamlined. So here is sort of like the root at where this all needs to be addressed. And in preparation of this, I just checked briefly, and I saw that there are many different electronic data capture companies. I found a list of almost 100 different companies, clinical trial management systems, a lot of people, and even the ECOA, so electronic clinical outcome assessment market, is being flooded by more and more companies. And that is a trend that will continue. And this is why basically some diverse and spread out information that was found in ICH E6 revision 2 already, and even before, are now compiled into one compact chapter on data governance. And data governance is all about establishing processes and actively managing in a risk-based manner, the full data lifecycle. You can see here on the right side, even again, as highlighted, risk proportionate. The measures by which expectation towards computerized systems should be described, and the quality measures should be implemented, should be risk proportionate. And there are some systems that are more impactful than others. But in the end, it's important to really crucially think about the full data lifecycle. Ensure data protection, confidential data, which has been highlighted in the guidance. Actively manage your computerized systems, also through user management and training. I'll get to that also in a minute. So safeguard essential trial elements, randomization, dose escalation, and blinding are just some examples. And a lot of focus was also put especially on blinding, because it seems that more and more clinical trials have issues with undesired premature unblinding because of the diverse systems that are being used. And in the end, use your system to support key decision-making along the process. And so there is a clear definition of different steps of the data lifecycle. I think it is quite well prepared, and it gives guidance on all of them. And it starts by highlighting how to manage data capture to begin with. And it introduces also the concept, or not introduces, but highlights the concepts of risk-based data verification from a point of data capture as a real fundamental starting point. Because if here the data is not managed well, of course, all of the downstream steps will not work either. One of the things that is then highlighted, which is a bit of more of a new take, is the active management of metadata and the audit trail. So obviously, the requirement for an audit trail and having metadata because of it has been in clinical research for a long time. It's basically just a translation of the principles that investigators needed to work at from paper over to an electronic system. But now there is more of an active call to track and review activities of user and systems. So really more actively utilize this feature to oversee trial quality and data flow. On top of this, one snippet, it's a really small detail, but one that I really enjoyed, so I wanted to highlight it here, is that it's now expressly stated that audit trails can be modified in rare but documented circumstances. Why is this important? Because anyone that's conducting clinical trials in Europe will know that the moment a document is uploaded, well, I guess globally, for example, an image of a patient or a scan of a patient, and the patient information, your name is there, it needs to be redacted. So document is deleted, new document is uploaded. However, in the audit trail as it exists now, this document remains accessible. And it must have been accessible based on prior regulations because you were not allowed to delete parts of your audit trail. And so this helps for data protection reasons to make sure that these cases can be documented and removed finally from the audit trail of your trial. So that's very encouraging. Third step along the way is transfer of data, which should be controlled. That means reconciliation, or follow a validated process. If you have an electronic tool, an electronic system that manages the data transfer for you, then of course there's an opportunity to really utilize a process that you establish first, that you validate first, that you generate evidence for that it works, and then you use that during the trial without needing excessive controls for your data. And that's how basically you can gain a little bit of efficiency. Also, an important step that was highlighted is what needs to be done for finalization of data sets. And this doesn't only concern the query resolution, for example, but it also concerns how are patients assigned to different analysis sets for the statistical analysis. What is the clear threat here? And this needs to be well documented so that it's very clear from the final data. How did you get to the final data from the data that was originally entered? And what did you do after the data was received to get to what you finally use for statistical analysis? That all needs to be encapsulated well. So, does anything change? Well, there's a couple of things here that I think are important to highlight. First of all, a couple of things that are, because everything that I talked about in the last slide, most of it was present before. Computer system validation, for example, is a big topic that has existed for many years. It's not new, it wasn't added now, although a lot of text in the latest revision talks exactly about computer system validation. So it remains valid and important, but what is really sort of like some of the changing factors? And here we have, among others, also clarity on requirements for site-based systems. And that's something that looks into the future, at least from a European perspective. I think from a US perspective, that's to be judged slightly differently. But electronic health records that are used as sources for data, if they are utilized in clinical research and sometimes, accessed and then used as a data source for, remote source data verification, for example, then it needs to be sure that, the access, the transfer of information, the interaction between systems works. And it's a sponsor's job to evaluate these systems used by the study site, but it's also expressly the site's responsibility if they want to use their own system in a clinical trial to make sure that this system is qualified. And this is a huge burden for some of the study sites moving forward. I'm fairly certain, and none of them will allow for a sponsor to dictate what, electronic health record system they are using for trials. So it's not going to be easy to set into motion, but it's clearly defined that both sides, if the site implements systems on their own or use in clinical trials, need to work together to validate the system. As I highlighted before, there's now also a stronger focus on maintaining study plans because of prior issues that were observed. And there were a lot of details also added towards how user management and training should be conducted. Especially given the diversity of systems we have, training the users is very important and sometimes not sufficient to really make sure that they are familiar with the systems, especially in high-frequency study sites. And user management has always been important, but it's also really important to maintain an active overview of who has control of which elements of the data. So, will this impact computer system usage? I would say only in parts, because it expands on a lot of good existing requirements. Good, that's in the eye of the beholder in the end, but we have very robust system requirements already. And they were already there in revision 1 of ICH GCP and expanded upon in revision 2, which put a focus on moving from paper to electronic. But some of the details and specifications were added, and really, as I said before, this risk-based approach was emphasized. So as a recommendation, it is good to define the flow of data in your trial, but please do so only in a risk-appropriate manner, because it is very easy to get carried away and wanting to define it always. But if there's only one source of documentation, that's the source data at the study sites, and it's entered into one EAC system, then you do not need to define your flow of data. If, however, you have a dozen systems from several e-core solutions to electronic patient-reported outcome, to randomization tools, to EDC, to drug accountability, to central labs, imaging sites, then it is worthwhile really defining what the flow of data is, who has access on what, and how to streamline all of this. Make sure that in the end, what you get is one central database with validated data. And if necessary, define risk of these individual data steps. And that can stem from delays of data transfers because it's first collected at one side and then it's moved into a central repository. That can be from manual processes, that can be from end-to-end automation processes that are, of course, of high risk, but once they are validated, they provide a good source of streamlining the trial and much more. So, if necessary, define quality controls or process validation steps for all of them. But again, only if necessary, really approach this from a risk-based quality management point of view. And there is the same thing that's always true. If everything is highlighted as important, then nothing is important. It's that easy. And documenting extensively is really not necessary unless the risk of the entire trial or the data flow calls for it. So this covers the two main big topics and changes within ICH GCP revision 3. And now there's a couple of more smaller topics that I want to touch upon. And the first one is a little bit of resource allocation. And there are many things that slightly changed or were slightly reworded, but there's a couple of things that maybe are necessary to talk about a little bit. And I'm not talking about management of resources from the sponsor side of things. It's good to see that, and I was surprised by it, frankly speaking. Before, there were clear mentionings that the investigator must have enough resources to conduct the trial, but not the sponsor. And now it is also clearly stated that the sponsor must have sufficient resources to manage the trial. But what's more impactful is that rules for delegation of investigators have been improved. And I truly mean improved, since you can see here on the left, other appropriately qualified healthcare professionals may be involved in the medical care of trial participants in line with their normal activities in accordance with local regulatory requirements. Before, it was quite clear that anything related to medical care was pretty much in the hands of the investigator or qualified dentist, depending on the type of trial. And now this is expanded a bit and reflective more so of what happens in the day-to-day. And honestly, you probably wouldn't want an investigator to do a blood draw for patients anyway, because that's something that other staff at the study site does better. Of course, tasks that can be delegated also need to be documented that they have been delegated and that the staff is qualified, but it gives more flexibility and it is more of a reflection of what actually happens at the study site. So, in addition to that, one of the things that at least partially becomes more attractive within clinical research because it's so competitive is that investigators select service provider to take over some responsibilities for the study sites, such as, flying study nurses or flying study coordinators that are sort of like working at the study sites to help with data entry, query resolution, patient pre-screening, and so on. And it's clearly stated now in Revision 3 that the investigator has the right to refuse service providers selected by the sponsor. Honestly, I think that was there before, and I don't think it's something that needs to be written into the guidance because you would never accept something and you would rather probably step out of the clinical trial if you didn't agree with it. But it's good to find this acknowledged in the guidance. And then, of course, with more delegation comes even more necessity to oversee delegated activities. And that's true for both sponsors and investigators. Any of the delegated activities must clearly be transparently executed by those delegated to ensure that this oversight condition, which has been very prevalent already in Revision 2, is maintained well. And transparency by service providers, and that's those that are working for the sponsors, which are mostly CROs, or those that are working at investigators, that there always is transparency in what is being done, and there's communication about what's happening to make sure that oversight is maintained. Moving on to accessibility, and of course that's a really big topic and a much bigger topic still in the US, since the FDA is really pushing this a lot. And here you can see that a lot of transparency of clinical trials and drug development is necessary, and therefore there is a call for publishing information in publicly accessible and recognized databases, as well as publicly posting the clinical trial results. For those that are conducting drug trials in Europe, this is not new because the clinical trial regulations already enforces this. In fact, we also have demands for publishing summaries for laypersons. But I think what is really important is for this to actually be recognized to that degree. And there are people that are much more eloquent at phrasing this than me, but the patient journey does not end at the last study visit. For them, this is not the end of the road. But for a lot of clinical trials and the way they executed it, patient information really stops there. And sometimes there's just no information to be had. And it's really important to make that much more accessible. And if you want to follow along, the journey of someone that are more vocal about this than I am, I would recommend Jan Geisler from Petrokids. He's doing a great job in really phrasing this. Also, to make clinical trials more accessible, more stakeholders should be involved in the creation of the design, the protocol development, as well as the selection of computer systems. And that's really important because their perspective is unique to themselves, but a representation of who the trial is actually designed for. Patients, study sites, investigators conducting the trials. So identifying and involving these stakeholders early on is important. It's not mandatory. You don't have to do it. That's not the call for it. But it is something that is good to keep in mind to design efficient and targeted clinical trials. And so there is a call for a more diverse patient population, but it's with an asterisk, unfortunately, as even in ICH GCP revision 3, it says as appropriate. And the FDA has been doing a better job in really pushing for more diversity than what we are seeing here. And it is a bigger topic there. Then let's talk about informed consent. And it's very great to see that more forms of informed consent are being embraced actively in ICH E6 revision 3. You can see it here in the code on the right side. So varied approaches can be used to inform, and you can even obtain it remotely. And some of the suggestions that were included here are those of images, videos, and other interactive methods. And this transfers a very important message. The informed consent process shouldn't be an obligation to fulfill in clinical research. It should be a process by which the person that is experimented on, frankly speaking, the patient, the trial participant, that they are fully aware of what they're getting themselves into. And long text written information is not the best to digest for the vast majority of people. And so providing opportunities of approaching it differently and seeing this also embraced by revision 3 is great. The same is, of course, true with remote informed consent. I'm sure in Europe, or at least in Germany, it'll take a little bit longer before we are there, but it's great to see it push in that direction. In the end, of course, ethics committees will need to review everything that you present to a patient. That's good that it is like that. But nevertheless, embracing these new forms of informing patients and then just having them sign on the long text written informed consent form is good seeing in revision 3. So how to best inform trial participants? There is no right answer. At least I don't know of one. And I don't think I'm the right person to speak up on it, but it's an important question. And I think that the preferences differ vastly between regions and indications and age groups. And so this goes back to knowing, or rather engaging, trial population before the trial and understanding what their needs are and what they would best like to see. So let's round it up by talking a little bit about trial documentation. Now, two things I want to talk about here. One is a trial protocol, and then the second thing is essential records. So obviously, the trial protocol is the centerpiece of clinical research and has always been. And so naturally, there's a very clear and defined structure already present, of which not so many things would change, frankly speaking. But there's a couple of clear statements here. One of them is also that the protocol should be designed in such a way as to minimize unnecessary complexity and to integrate or eliminate important risks to the rights, mitigate or eliminate important risks to the rights, safety, and well-being of trial participants, as well as the reliability of data. So when we look at the clinical trial protocol, at the level of designing it, some form of high-level important factors for quality control should ideally be included, but I would strongly encourage you, and even revision 3 continues strongly encouraging you to also formulate a lot of this in external documents. This is always better because it is a time-consuming process that you, if necessary, ideally spend a little bit of time on. And so not doing that in the preparation of the most important piece for the clinical trial, that's the trial protocol, which you want to get to submission, can sometimes be beneficial. Also, amending these elements is easier if they are not part of your clinical trial protocol, which needs to go through a review and approval process. Some of the things that are highlighted a bit more, that were always important, but that are now put sort of like on the forefront, are that it is important to pre-specify decision-making criteria. And that sometimes that can be a DSMB or a data safety monitoring board, a data monitoring committee, so external committees that decide on modifications of the clinical trial. If they exist, then information on their existence and decision pattern should be provided. Most of it you will put out in charter that is outside of the protocol, but at least you should establish that they do come to decisions and the important criteria should be highlighted in the protocol. The same is true for adaptation of clinical trials. That has become much more relevant over the years, even since we had revision 2, which is not that long ago. And it is really important to embrace it and allow for these criteria to be implemented, but they must also be implemented if adaptive designs are chosen. And finally, of course, the estimate framework is also highlighted for those of you that haven't read ICH E9 yet, which is the statistics guidance. In the revision 1, this focus specifically on estimates framework. It's optional, but if you use it, it should be provided in the study protocol. Also, what should be, if applicable, highlighted in this trial protocol are decentralized trial elements, which have become much more prevalent. And so it is requested, let's say, or suggested that those elements of the trial that can be conducted in a decentralized manner should be conducted, should be laid out in the study protocol. And in the end, a clear call, and that goes from the principles of ICH GCP through the design of the trial protocol in Appendix B. It's important to focus on recording essential information and staying operationally feasible. There is usually a tendency to record too much, to put too much density into your clinical trials, and utilize the opportunity to include a couple more assessments, but that makes it harder and harder to not only comply, to not make issues, and creates, fractions of the data and protocol deviations, but it also takes away focus of what's really important for a trial. So staying focused is important here. And lastly, and that's good also, some of the logistical information around study sites no longer need to be included. That includes, for example, the telephone number of the principal investigator. I don't know why there's a recommendation to include it in the trial protocol. In Europe, it would always have to be redacted for publishing the trial protocols according to clinical trial regulations. So that's also been removed. Now let's talk about the last point, which is essential records. So the nature and extent of records generated and maintained depend on a lot of factors, but should be driven again by a risk-based approach. And now the way that the Appendix C, which lists the essential records for trials, has been structured has changed from no longer focusing on the individual trial elements, startup, active phase, and close down, but rather focusing on essential records for all trials that are always needed and those that are potentially, which means basically if they are created, then they are essential documents. All essential documents or essential documents for all trials include the IE protocol, pretty much approvals and notifications, and anything you submit to ethics committees or regulatory authorities, as well as any form of source documents and study data. And that's it, if you want to summarize it like that. And the potential documents where there's a long list of what constitutes an essential record, and a lot of it is then also, let's say, captivated in this list of potentially essential documents. The summary is, if you're working according to the TMF reference model, don't expect any changes, really. Okay, so let me use the few last minutes to briefly connect on a summary and then go over to a question and answer period. So, is the necessary clarity provided? I said at the beginning that I felt there is a strong need to provide a lot of clarity in the application, actually, of risk-based approaches to gain this efficiency and gain the security. And the answer to that is no, but I think we took a little bit of a step in the right direction. I would have hoped for more clarity, not only throwing in a buzzword fit for purpose, but really providing guidance on what it means. And that is not yet included in the document. Will it revolutionize clinical research, as the title of this webinar suggests? The answer is unlikely. Maybe something changed between now and the final version. But in the form that it is in now, I would not expect this to have a significant revolutionizing aspect. But more guidance is definitely given overall in this document for some of the elements. It would be more revolutionizing and more empowering, this guideline, if more guidance was given on what constitutes high versus low risk overall. And because that is really key to efficient clinical trial conduct. So that means, moving on, what should we focus on? And that pretty much brings back to the first two topics that I highlighted. Risk-based trial execution on all levels. And this is much more prominent now, not on only certain levels, not on only oversights, not on only monitoring. On all levels, risk-based trial execution is important. From design to process to reporting, involving the stakeholders, monitoring the data. Everything should be risk-based. So be prepared to really structurally understand processes and the trial overall, let's say, in a first step, and then only narrow it down based on how the risk over of the trial is, and use that as a catalyst. And in the end, be mindful when selecting systems. They should support your trial conduct. And it's always important to compare complexity of the systems with the efficiency that they gain the trial. And sometimes it can just be overburdened for study sites, for participants, for trial complexity, or increase the likelihood of something happening. So that brings me to the end, and I'll have some more time for questions for this as well. You can connect to us. There's a link tree highlighted on the right side for all of us. You can also connect to me directly. That's really not a problem. I'm always happy to discuss clinical research and my impressions. You can visit our website or our YouTube channel, where we'll post also the recording of this webinar. And with that, I want to thank everyone for the attendance, and I'm very happy to receive questions if there are any in chat.